Thank you for listening to the Content Magazine podcast, Conversations with Silicon Valley's Creatives. I'm Daniel Garcia, your host and the cultivator of Content Magazine, published by SV Creates. Hello, welcome to the Content Magazine podcast. I'm Daniel Garcia, the cultivator of Content Magazine, and we are here at the San Jose Institute of Contemporary Art with Rhonda Holberton, and she has an exhibition here called A Knotted World. Rhonda, you're also at San Jose State in the digital media design. What's your role and what's your title with that?
Perfect, thank you. I teach in the digital media art area. I am an assistant professor, just got tenure, so in September we'll be associate professor, and then I am associate chair for the department, which means more administrative work and less of the art and fun teaching part. But it also is helping kind of integrate my practice a little and the department a little bit more within the community here at San Jose, San Jose. So that's kind of exciting.
Yeah, and you were teaching at Stanford too.
Yeah,
before.
So I cut my teeth at Stanford. In experimental design, kind of crossing between the art department and experimental design.
Okay.
The design components of that have now kind of merged completely within the art department, but I got to design a couple new classes when I was teaching there.
Awesome.
And those have made their way into my teaching practice at San Jose State. So they are definitely inflected and influenced by my work.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. The whole time you were teaching, you were also producing creative artists at the same time. You haven't stopped.
No.
Yeah, so you're a pretty busy person.
I am. But I like to find synergy between the teaching practices and the studio practices.
Yeah.
And I think that that's really good for the students
Sure.
to have those experiences.
Yeah.
In addition to those, I'm also working on a couple grants that are more community focused, which are necessarily include the students.
Okay.
Around ethics and technology and digital stewardship.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Yeah. So then let's, before we kind of get into the details of the type of digital work and media that you're with, I saw that you began out kind of more in sculpture. It's kind of like your art form. How did you first get into art growing up, and then we'll talk about how that transferred into engineering and what you're doing now. But what was your home like? How did you get into art and creativity?
I think I was like the most rebellious thing I could think of. My dad was an engineer and my mom was in business. And so I always make the joke now that artists make engineers and engineers make artists.
Yeah.
For me, those two practices are intimately coupled. But I knew that I wanted to be an artist at a very young age. And I really liked sculpture because it could be anything.
Right.
So my undergraduate degree was in sculpture. But at the time I was also kind of dabbling in engineering practices.
Okay.
When I was in high school, you could take a coding class to substitute for algebra or one of the mathy classes, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm there.
Totally.
I want to write code.
Yeah.
I don't want to do these equations. The kind of abstract form didn't make any sense to me, but if I could apply these kind of logical concepts, I could get there. So always had coding as a backup. And when I was an undergrad, I put myself through school by making jewelry and websites. And so
cool.
Those two practices, through the jewelry, I actually started playing around with CAD/CAM. That was my first exposure to engineering, 3D modeling practices. And then the website building kind of kept me fresh in code. And when I was a student at CCA, California College of the Arts, there was this course taught, I think, out of the video and film department, but it was Barney Haynes, and what was it called? Interface, I think the class was. And it was the first time I actually kind of brought code into my sculptural practices, using sensors to kind of sense movement around things and actuate motors to start make drawings. And so that's also another place where some of the CAD and kind of engineering practices started coming into play.
Yeah. So when you were younger, then, to get it, I always kind of think there's definitely creativity and different type of art forms, but sculpture to me always, I'm kind of fascinated, because were you more thinking in terms already of just kind of like environment and space as kind of like you were growing, and that's why you sculpture? Or was it sculpture because you could do something with a drill, and you could do something with glue, and you could do something with paint? What was kind of like the draw in that kind of?
I mean, I think I was always thinking, even in high school, because of the place that I grew up in Northern Virginia, in many ways it's kind of like the government version of Silicon Valley, right?
Okay,
They call
sure.
it Dulles Corridor instead of Silicon Valley. So a lot of the tech contractors, my dad being one of them, were based in Northern Virginia, but it was still a very, when I moved there, a very rural place.
Right.
And so I watched these farmlands kind of get steamrolled over, and these, subdivisions pop up. And, my family, where I was a part of that movement, but it also felt like a loss. And so I was really interested. I'll never forget, I was a photographer taking photos in one of these communities that had been built in the 70s that was being demolished.
Right.
For the kind of
Progress.
updated suburbs. The town that I grew up in was called Reston. It was one of the first planned communities. So everything was supposed to be walkable. There were footpaths everywhere, no parking lots. The shopping centers kind of faced inwards towards community centers, which totally didn't work with like families with two cars. So they kind of bulldozed a lot of it. So on top of the bulldozing of the farmland, I also saw this kind of, this idea of this utopic vision of kind of communal living also being bulldozed.
Yeah.
So I was fascinated by those kind of two things happening, even in high school. And so one of those communities had completely been vacated. People left with things in their refrigerators, clothes still hanging in the closet.
Like they just bugged out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because it was all being bulldozed, it didn't matter if they left stuff. So one of the families had spray painted, lived here from 1970 whatever until 1997 or something. And I was taking photos in this community, and I could hear the bulldozers kind of coming down,
Okay.
But I couldn't, I was using this really janky, whatever I could afford at the time, film camera, and when I went to pull the film out, I couldn't. So I had to destroy the film to pull it out. And to me, I was like, actually, that's kind of better. And I hadn't really been introduced to conceptual art at that time, but I think that was a catalyzing moment for me, thinking that, this kind of performance of trying to capture an image, the failure of the image, the kind of glitch of the camera, that it all kind of came together in a really beautiful and poetic moment.
Do you still have that roll of film anywhere?
Oh man, I totally should have kept it.
That would have been awesome to
I still have this muscle memory, just feeling it kind of cut, and I brought it into the dark room because I knew I would have to expose it. So I also was trying to get it out blind. Yeah. So there was Did
it rip or something?
Oh yeah, it totally ripped. And then I was like, there might have been ways to recover it, if I really tried to. But I also thought that there was something about the loss of recapturing these intimate moments that was felt appropriate, right? Maybe it wasn't my image to be taken.
It's so interesting because your work now there's so much geographical based information as well, what you're creating, space, and then to see that even at a younger age, kind of seeing it, the bulldozing technology kind of destroying, and so it's interesting. Are those something that do you think you consciously brought that through your career, or was it something that you just found yourself gravitated to? Which would you, or a mixture of both? How would you say that?
Yeah, I think at the time, I was pulling at threads, whatever I thought was interesting. Yeah. There was also this kind of crossover between these kind of squatter communities, and I was into punk, and I was in DC, and so the pictures that I was taking at that time kind of was following kind of a rebellious anarchist,
Punk, if it's punk.
exactly. But I was kind of more hippie punk, which made more sense out here. I'm realizing later, but what I think when I look back, it's really easy to trace that through line.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, of course, I was interested, like another, I was interested in these marginal spaces and like finding where like I had access to things and where I didn't, and where that tension was.
Yeah.
And another kind of catalyzing moment was also this abandoned farm and, taking photos of these like rusting machines with vines growing over them with AOL headquarters in the background. And inside the headquarters is like a Boeing 747 in this like glass walled lobby with this like decaying with this decaying, vegetation and home, like just yards away. And so that was another one of those pivotal moments. And in fact, in the show, there's works that definitely pick up on some of those threads.
Is it the theme of the juxtaposition and kind of like the dichotomy of those kind of things and new growth and death? Is that? Yeah,
I think that kind of transferred, like it picks up on some larger thematics, now that I can see really clearly. And one of my current bodies of work, I'm working with an AI bot, this kind of tension of like what it means to give birth or to create, which dovetails with a couple of the other thematics in my work. So I think that it's really, again, in hindsight, to pull these threads and to see the early work and the way that, I forget who it was, there's a choreographer who says that we really only have 5 cards as artists, that we just kind of keep reshuffling our hands.
That's interesting. Okay.
But I'm happy to see that in my work.
What would you say for you? What's your 5 cards? Have you thought about that part of it?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. So I would definitely say that kind of environmental concerns, what I would say this kind of, and the crossing of technology and environmental concerns, kind of social care and stewardship that keeps coming back in my work. And then also I think like third wave like thinking about like colonialism through like an imperialism through like a feminist lens. Those are probably
the top four. What's the 5th one?
I think that might be, what would be the 5th one? Pushing my body and technology to extremes so that we both kind of break together.
So you kind of break together.
Yeah,
that's interesting. So I did see you said something about technology. I don't know if you were quoting somebody, but he was talking about kind of like the artist's role of exploring the failures of the successes, or something along the success of technology, and then the failures. So talk about that, even in these 5 forms that you're doing. How do you see your role in society and your work, kind of like that? That dichotomy of
it's something I actually
success and failure.
Talk about with my students a lot, like both practically in terms of like, sometimes our failures as artists are successful, right? Like it might not be the end product, but there's something that you learn a lot about in that failure. There's also another way to kind of read that through another framework, which I think in Silicon Valley and in the Bay Area, this kind of tension between engineering perhaps as like kind of a positivist like expansion versus the art practice, which is a little bit more skeptical and kind of questioning. So one of the things that I like to do, especially when teaching and thinking, more broadly about my role in the world, is to combine those 2 frameworks. So what are the ways that a project can fail if it's successful, right? And we kind of can see this in hindsight with Facebook. What are the ways that Web 2.0 was actually a failure because it is so successful? And I think teasing some of those questions out before a technology is released into the world might be a better practice. And you can see tech companies struggling with this. Google introduced an ethics board, which I think failed within, a couple of months of its instantiation. But it's also a lot easier to do when you're in the engineering, part of it when you're in the planning stages of
Right.
a product, rather than trying to cap something or
Yeah.
put up bumper rails after the fact.
Yeah.
And we can see this with AI right now. I think that that's really where, my kind of interest and focus has been.
Yeah, yeah. Would you say, like with AI, what technology kind of scares you? Like, is AI kind of like in that realm of like, oh, I'm fascinated, it's going to be so great, but also do you see the danger? And
I mean, I think the technology is fascinating.
Okay.
I do think that there are ways that, like, if we're talking about artificial general intelligence, which is not what we have, that's like the singularity kind of consciousness.
Right.
I do think that, like if we ask AI in that sense, how do we solve climate change? I'm afraid of what its answer would be, right?
Yeah.
I think that we can all kind of follow the dots, like,
Yeah.
If humans are causing, then,
Yeah.
yeah.
like
So,
every science fiction movie since 1942.
Right. But that is actually not my greatest concern with AI.
Okay.
My greatest concern with AI is not a technology problem, but a social problem.
Right.
We can see some of the kind of social inequities and economic inequities
Yeah.
that technology, especially here in the Bay Area, has brought.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily the technology's in and of itself fault. I think it's a failure of like us to kind of compensate with regulation or kind of
Yeah.
social programs. And this is where like no longer anarchist kind of fully
Right. But activist, I would
but
say.
activist,
Yeah.
yeah. I can't not care about the world that I live in and what I see in the world.
So do you see then yourself as your role as a creator and an artist? Do you see like that activism, or is it just awareness, or is it prophetic, or like future scene, or what would you say kind of like is the nugget that you see your
I think
role as artist?
artists can be both. I think, embedding artists, some of the earliest art and technology experiments, EAT, experiments in art and technology, were produced out of Bell Labs, which at the time was like, kind of a IT infrastructure company. And you saw engineers getting coupled with artists like Andy Warhol and Robert Rauschenberg, to create these really speculative projects.
Yeah.
Now, was the art that came out of it great? No, but I actually think, getting artists and engineers in the room together to kind of talk about the possibilities of technology was really fruitful.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think, getting philosophers, getting ethicists, getting artists in a room, with kind of some of these technology companies early on could produce, it's very different practices, right? So it's hard to kind of cross that divide.
Yeah.
But I think artists are really good at creating new paths.
Yeah.
If
Asking
anything else.
the questions.
Yeah, and
right?
figuring
What
out
if-
how to get from A to B, right?
Yeah.
It's something I kind of talk about with my students. And when I first started teaching, I was teaching primarily engineers. But so I would, this is kind of focused towards them and not necessarily my art students, although I think there's a lot of crossover.
Yeah.
But when we start thinking about, how do we design products? How do we make great products?
Yeah.
Good engineers can solve problems, but great engineers know how to ask the questions.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I think that there's something that's utilitarian that could be useful and like make better engineers. But I also think we can start mitigating some of the impacts, negative impacts of technology earlier in the stage if we get artists and the humanities and the sciences talking
Totally.
sooner.
I think it seems like there's been a transition over the last 15, 20 years when just the designers and the engineers have kind of like come together much more than they used to be. It used to be two different departments. It seemed like people are thinking user interface and all those kind of things have kind of like made that, like have brought that about, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah. So then for you, when you approach your work, I'm sure it's different for each thing, but what kind of like, is it first like kind of like, oh, I want to experiment with this technology, and then you kind of think in terms of producing something, or is it something like, oh, I want to try this sculpture or process, and then you kind of come up with the message, and how does that all work for you in your process? Because you have castings over here, you have 3D imagery, you have silk with design? I mean, video projection with, there's a vast array of stuff that you're doing. So I'm trying to think, what drives to the conclusion of your production?
Yeah, I think,
process.
So going back to those, 5 pillars or, like my deck of 5 cards, I think that last one that you were able to identify with me, the kind of performative aspect is a primary focus. So I need to start playing with the technology and then the ideas come. Okay. So sometimes, so I started with one of the projections here, the kind of 3 bodies kind of combined in this chimeric. Yeah,
the actor was.
Yeah, all the actors have withdrawn. And I had just started playing with the Kinect sensor. At the time, they had opened up and provided an SDK for the sensor, Microsoft did. And so you could pull out the 3D data from the sensor. And if you do, it's basically taking an image, sending out a spray of infrared dots, and based on the displacement of the dots, the sensor knows how close something is to the sensor. So if you can take these kind of slices of this 3D information and then kind of slice them back together, you can start creating a 3D model. Yeah. But there weren't apps yet to kind of make that easy. So I just started playing with the technology to just stitch this thing back together. Yeah. And I just started by kind of scanning myself, and I did some research into the technology itself. So I want to understand both how to use the technology, but how it came into being. Yeah. And it turned out that the sensor technology was based on technology developed by the Israeli military. Like most technologies, especially sight and sensing technologies. And then Microsoft bought the technology directly from the engineers who were ex-military. And so then I started thinking about this kind of history of this war embedded in this now game, device. Yeah. And so I started, teaching myself Krav Maga, as you do, and then taking 3D scans of my body in offensive and, defensive positions. Yeah. And I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it, but it's just perform the thing and see what happens. Yeah. I think it very much like painting, laying down a brush stroke and then seeing the conversation that's having and then laying down another one. Yeah. But when I imported the scans, the kind of 3D objects into the 3D modeling program, I had all of the scans they all go to the same place and they're all on top of one another. Yeah. I was like, oh my God, that's it. It's perfect. That's the thing. Yeah. And I think that's all that it needs to be. Yeah. So I just, have this rotating body on acrylic. Yeah, that's good. So so in some ways it's kind of just curiosity in playing, you're playing and, but I would just think that in the technology aspect of it, I feel like it adds a lot more dedication and time. I think of course a painter, but if you're painting, there's an instant kind of gratification, but this is there's the process of scanning and then figuring out the code, bringing it in. Yeah. I don't know, it seems like it's very involved. Well, I think that's part of my brain likes to take things apart and figure out how it works. Yeah. Part of me is very much interested in this kind of activism and understanding where things came from and where they're going. Yeah. And so, it's that embedding myself performatively with the technology, but also, there's a lot of what I would call pleasure in the hard engineering for me. Yeah. So, even though it takes time, painting takes time. I think, I recently had a show with paintings, which I've actually never done, but made in concert with AI. And so I was just, again, kind of pressing up into uncomfortable spaces with me and my body. So I don't, I wouldn't say, it's, I do think that technology brings in a very specific conversation in a way that would be hard to do with paint because I don't have to jump through as many, hoops to get to the conversation that I want to have about technology because I'm using the technology already. Right. It's already there. Yeah, right?
Yeah. So I started to ask you, but what technology kind of scares you right now? What's the thing that you're kind of oh, this is like a powder keg or this? Is there anything in particular?
Yeah, I mean, so the part of the AI that I'm most afraid of, it is AI, of course, like what, that I'm most afraid of is actually kind of an artifact of Web 2, which is, humans' misuse or like use of the technology for nefarious ends, right? And we already have such a kind of, fractured public, right? We don't have, communities that agree on reality anymore. And if we're already on a slippery slope with which reality we're living in, if we can generate real looking things automatically, it's going to accelerate that kind of divide. And I think, we're just, our brains, our bodies, our like the human biological body, has not caught up to technology. The things that get us riled up and the things that motivate us to act were really, really great when, there's a wolf coming at you. But maybe if you're just like sitting there on email, and the same, hormones are going through your body, that's maybe not the most healthy thing, both for the individual, but also for the community.
Then what do you think, what is the future of humanity with this? I mean, with technology, what do you kind of see? Is there hope for us?
I do think so. And here's why. So the things that AI will be good at are the things that are kind of high value right now. So, good design and, writing code. So those are high value activities. So we're going to go through growing pains while the things that are high value and high labor value in terms of labor start becoming less valuable. But I also think that that's good because it's going to mean that people with resources are going to care about things like UBI and like what it means to be a human and like how we should care for all humans in the world. But I also think that it's going to do something interesting where we're going to need poets to write code. Right? I think it's going to do a good thing for humans. The things that are really enjoyable for us, these might actually become high value again. Right? And so I do think that there's hope, but I think, there's a lot of, and then there's social problems, there's social political problems. But I don't think they're insurmountable, right? It's not inevitable, like the way that we live right now and the internet, how it works, it's not inevitable. It was always a decision that somebody made, and I tell this to my students all the time. We can write better rules. It's going to be hard, but this is not inevitable. We can write better rules that take care of more people.
I guess the thing is nefarious people are just as creative as ethical people too, right? So that's the thing. I think no matter what you do, like a knife is great for cutting meat, but it can also kill somebody. I mean, that's the scary thing. There's nothing that you can produce that can't be abused, unfortunately, right?
Exactly. And I think, AI, if we want to go down the rabbit hole, some of the things that make it so powerful are the same things that I think make it the most very dangerous, right? So totally. I've been thinking a lot about the ways that the camera changed creative practices for artists. And when the photographic process first came about, we said painting was dead, right? But it wasn't. It wasn't. The fact that this technology could capture reality in this, amazing detail meant that painters were no longer beholden to creating realistic images. And so it exploded, right? So I'm really, now, what are the ways that the camera is the same to AI, and how is AI different? And AI, the camera can do one thing really well. So it kind of touched a segment of society that wanted to reproduce the world. AI can reproduce the world. It can make a picture. It can make a painting. It can guide a self-guided missile. It can it can write more code. It can replicate itself. So I think that the ways that we've kind of thought about, disruption in the past might not be useful when we think about this kind of disruption that cuts across so many different industries and activities.
Now you're starting to work with like AI and chat GP type creative tools, right?
Yeah.
And how's your experience been with that? What are you finding out? What's making you excited about that?
Yeah, I mean, I started it because of my anxieties around the technology,
Yeah, sure.
which is frequently what I do, right? Like something that I don't understand. So let me play with it so that I at least understand what this thing is.
Yeah.
So I started, just kind of, with the easy access, ChatGPT, DALL-E, which are both open AI platforms. And so then I started kind of understanding what it could do. I was like, okay, well, I still don't really know what the project is, but I'm going to meditate on some of these anxieties, what it means to create, what it means to be a shepherd of creation, or a steward of creation, on the planet, and create these sculptures in my mind, and then see how close I can get DALL-E to creating these sculptures. And so, it actually did, it was a back and forth, this kind of play, this dialogue with it. Yeah. And then the sculptures that were the most interesting or the closest to my vision, I took those prompts and then I put them into ChatGPT and asked it to create a speculative fiction story, kind of set, 1,000 years in the future, kind of like, and talk about the creation of these entities. Right. And then, sometimes it like produces beautiful, amazing text, and then sometimes it creates a. We've already established that humans are extinct in this future, but then
does that happen a lot? Do you find?
No, it's actually something that because ChatGPT is trained on a bunch of data where it's like trying to figure out what I want, and it's like, oh, you want a story? Let's tell a story about like a human hero, like saving the day, right? Yeah. And so I kept reintroducing these characters. I'm like, remember GPT, like you've already made, humans that are now extinct. But then it would do things like it created this global network of the sculptures that I created, connected by a marble root system, and the sculptures started communicating with one another. And I was like, oh my God. I was like, please explain, describe, how are they communicating? And it was like, they use the sounds are like clicks, chirps, and hums. Okay. I was like, oh my God, that's brilliant. So I kind of, stuck that in my pocket. Yeah,
that's beautiful.
And then then I took those kind of surprising moments and asked ChatGPT or back to DALL-E to create images of those kind of, strange transitional moments that were completely fabricated, like not a part of my original vision. Right. And so I created paintings with those, both, the image of the painting was created, and then I would actually paint the image. And then those frames became the first frames of animations that I use another system built on top of Stable Diffusion called Deforum, which is another kind of more code-based AI. And then took those images and then seeded the first frame with the paintings, and then kind of had animations that moved through each chapter of the story that ChatGPT had created. And then while I was playing with that, I found another. So Stable Diffusion, I know. Yeah. Stable Diffusion is a open source, and so a lot of technologists have built apps on top of it. So Deforum being one of them for animations, and then another one was called Refusion, and it creates black and white images called spectrograms. Okay. And when you read a spectrogram back into an audio program, it creates a really complex audio. So it's basically a visualization of the sound for like 10 seconds. Huh. So I then asked Refusion to create the sounds that ChatGPT had created of these things communicating with one another.
Wow, that's crazy. So is kind of the goal, though, when you're putting in the prompts and stuff like that, is to get it to it, like refining it, but you're not actually especially like the story part, you're not going and editing it yourself. You're just giving new prompts to kind of steer it and correct it. And because you kind of want to get to a point where it's in some ways completely generated by the computer.
Yeah, I mean
the prompts, you're definitely involved.
Exactly. So, the raw material, like just coming out of the machine is like, for me, would be unusable. Yeah. Right. There's like parts of it that are too like squirmy. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Kind of like, ooh, that's like a poem that I would write when I was 12, or, just a little cringe, as the kids say. So but I think that there's a lot in there that is recoverable, right? And so one of the things that I was teaching, I think it was an embodied interface class at Stanford, and came across a sci-fi writer who would use chatbots, like early versions of chatbots, to produce dialogue for his characters, because it was, coming from somewhere else, and he wouldn't use the dialogue coming out of the chatbot one-to-one, because it was, again, like not unrecoverable, but there are moments in it that like spark his own creativity, so that he's able to kind of play with it. And so that's kind of the way that I feel like it's working. And part of my questions, in that show is like, can AI generated content be considered art, right? And like if we say it is art, because now it's in a gallery and it's made by me, so I think we like answered that question. But like, is it interesting, and what does it mean? What is my relationship to it? Do I feel that kind of proximity, that closeness of creation? And then what are other people's like relationship to the work? Because all art, I think, we're trying to connect. Humans are trying to connect through artistic gesture. So does that still hold?
Well, that's the thing, right? I mean, it's just another tool that you're using for inspiration. Like you're talking about, you did this and then you found this, right? So if you go to watch a movie, that might inspire you to write a song, right? So that it's still going through the human interface.
Yeah, and so that's another interesting question. What are the ways that like an AI is different than like a human me, that's taking in all of the content of the world and then kind of synthesizing it and then making a thing based on all of my combined experiences, right? It's not that I'm not referencing all of the information that I've been able to experience in my life. It's just that my lived experience can only hold so much information, and the AI can hold, like orders of magnitude more, right? And so it's calling on like the combined information available to it, which is not something that I can do, and it can find patterns in that information that I, as human, because I have limited experience, I can't.
And
do.
skills too, right? Like if I was to try to draw, I wouldn't be able to. But if I used a computer to help me bring the vision, right? I'm still creating it, but I don't have that particular skill, but it's a different skill set.
Exactly.
For
and so,
creativity.
I don't think in paintings, like I don't think that way. Like I do make images. Some of the images are more painterly, but I don't, I don't come up with like a 2D plane that can kind of unfold the conversations that I want to have. But I was able to, in some ways, with, or was I guess, like I think I did.
That's cool.
I think I did with the paintings.
What exhibition is that?
That was
it just
came
ended
down
like
last week.
Yeah.
But it was at Cult Amy Freeberg.
Right.
And it was called Two Handfuls of Silver Dust.
Yeah. And then, are you going to have pieces from that here at the ICA in the future or something? I'm sure.
Maybe.
I think so. We'll bit. Yeah. So then, what would you say for you? What is your kind of like guiding, like philosophy of life? How do you, not just for your work, but for you as just a person, get away from the doer, but the beer. Like how do you approach this world?
Like, my mom would always say, leave, if we're guests somewhere, leave the space better than we found it, right? Like as kind of just a way of being polite in the world, but I actually really take that to heart. And I think, what are the ways that I can leave the world slightly better than I found it? And I think it's hard, it's a hard thing to do as a human in the 21st century, but I think my art is an attempt to do that through conversations like this, right? But I also think my teaching practice is a lot of that too. And so how do I show through my own practice, but also through teaching, that folks who might not think about themselves as technologists, that they can do it, right? And even if they are not interested in pursuing that professionally, I think exposing, some of the mystery around these engineering practices, which seem so fancy and so hard to do, is like, no, you can write a line of code. Let's do it, right? And so you demystify that, and then I think people can be better agents in the world themselves because they understand how things come into being.
Yeah, that's cool. So you're trying to leave this place better.
I'd like to.
I don't know if that's a right sentence.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, but like maybe you don't, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there are always, unintended consequences, and something that is better for you might not be better for someone else.
Yeah.
But I think paying attention and being kind, and following your inspiration. This kind of dovetails with the AI conversation. Yeah. I like to tell my students, it's my practice is very research based, but I do a lot of research. And then I have these like weird moments of inspiration, right? And that is, what is an AI if like not that?
Right.
That,
it's all
right?
kind of like a research.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Your intuition is nothing but your kind of best guess based on the sum total of your experiences. And that's something uniquely human and something to be taken seriously and to pay attention to.
Yeah. Okay, so then let's say for here at the Institute of Contemporary Art, your current show, Not a Knotted World, in what way is this leaving the world better place? Right. What was the themes you were
So the work here covers about 10 years of production, and the way that I work are kind of in these thematics. Like even if there's separate pieces in an exhibition, they all kind of have a conversation together. So this is the first time I saw a lot of these pieces in the same space together. Okay. But I think a lot of these pieces here are kind of, again, made 10-ish years apart, but obviously related. And they're looking at ways that technology specifically and military technologies make their way into the intimacies of everyday life, and the ways that we as humans kind of hold in our bodies these technologies, a very cyborgian kind of thought. And also ways that we can play with our material world and technologies to better understand our impact in the world and the material impacts that digital signals have. I like to do a great job there.
That's cool. Yeah, so for instance, so then the tying in, so the back camouflage, military, and then the scanning of I'm sorry, what was the title again?
All the actors have withdrawn.
Right, so that was a military scanning device.
Yeah.
And then in the room there, the best of both worlds. Yeah. How does that then tie into that theme of kind of what you're talking about? This, well, I guess it ties into the cyborg. Talk about that.
The cyborgian body.
Yeah.
So one of the things, that I frequently kind of tease out when I'm thinking about the cyborg is, if the power goes out today and does not come back on, right? Like most of us wouldn't really make it, right? Like wouldn't fare too well. So the idea that we're a cyborgian or reliant on technology for our biological processes is very much already. We don't need the technology on us or in us. Like we're already there. Yeah. So when I was working with the 3D scanning of All the Actors Have Withdrawn, this is kind of the technology wasn't quite there yet, right? Like the scans are really broken and kind of distorted. And what I saw when I kind of was looking at the scans, I had this flash of the body, this broken pixelated body going through a yoga sequence to like trying to repair itself. Yeah. So I didn't know how to animate yet, so I had to teach myself those skills. Wow. But that became best of both worlds.
Right, yeah.
So
that's kind of very much a piece on thinking in terms of like the cyborg, the physicality and the digital. And then were you kind of thinking in terms that like you're doing yoga in your real world and it's restorative and healing, and then can that be brought into the AI world where a computer would do its own calisthenics or something? Is that kind of what you're playing with? Or?
Exactly. I think so. When I was making it, I had an undiagnosed autoimmune disorder, and I was just starting to feel some of the, some of that in my body, but I hadn't put a name to it, and I was like, oh, well, maybe it's just stress, or the way that I just hunch over a computer for hours,
Sure.
right? And so I was thinking a lot about the ways that technologies orient the body, but also the way that the body gets distorted when it's kind of pulled through the screen and kind of pushed out in the world again.
Yeah. So it's kind of like our interaction with technology is altering us, like definitely like sitting at the computer is affecting us, and even looking at the phone and changing our social structures. Physically changing us, but also like shaping the way that we see the world, and in so doing, shaping the way that we kind of create and design new technologies, right? So there's this circular in and out of the machine. Yeah. So then we're going to move into more medical scientific philosophy, but say they had some sort of digital implant that you could have that would restore you from like your physical health. Would you jump on that these days, or and become a cyborg?
Probably.
Would you
just
become
because
a cyborg?
I'm in so much pain all the time.
Yeah.
One of the things I'm dealing with is rheumatoid arthritis, which is like kind of a constant state of inflammation and pain. And so I think I would be brought physically through desperation to wanting to use it, but I think that would be in tension with, I was actually really slow to adopt using a cell phone. Like all of I don't use like the face recognition. I've never used a thumbprint. So so I actually I'm very interested in privacy, data rights and privacy rights online. But I honestly think that given the option, we have these meat sacks, that live and they age and then they die. Yeah. And I think, you see a lot of the technologists, what do they do when they have unlimited resources? Right. A lot of them are trying to become immortal, right? And I think that there is the fear of not being in the world any longer. Yeah. I don't necessarily have that. Maybe I just need 10 years, but what I have is a fear of being in this world and not being able to do the things that I want to do. Yeah. And I think, if there was a technology that could mitigate pain for so many people, then I actually think that would be a good thing. Yeah, totally. If I was to write a story, jumping off right here would be awesome. Like in this interface between technology and art. I was one of the first ones to get an implant, and then you become this real cyborg art project yourself, right? Wouldn't that be kind of cool? Yes, let's do it. You would take the performance spatial art to a whole next level. This is the thing too, is like part of the reason why I want to solve the climate crisis is because we're on the verge of so many cool things. Like I've always been, like as weary as I am technology, I am also so fascinated by it. I've always been into like science fiction and like possible futures. And it's like, if we can create technology that does more good than harm, it's about to get so weird and so wonderful that I want to see that future. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be here. And this exhibition at the San Jose Institute of Contemporary Art goes to August 13th. Yes. That sounds right. Yeah. So everybody make sure that you come. And what's your social media? Why don't you tell us your social media handles so people... Rhonda Holberton, my name. That's very confusing. I know. Well, cool. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks. That's it. Thank you for listening to the Content Magazine podcast. Follow us on social media at Content Mag. Become a member and help us to continue to tell the stories of the South Bay creatives. This episode's music is 408 by Jack Pavlina. Follow him on Spotify and also on his Instagram at Jack Pavlina Music.